Thank you very much to everybody who's come along. We're here now to talk about regulation, and it feels like the tide has very much turned, at least on this side of the Atlantic. Here in the UK, the Online Harms Bill has been announced. Ofcom is looking like it will be appointed the regulator of online platforms, and we are now waiting to see exactly what that might look like. Now, across the channel, the EU is pressing on with its Digital Services Act, highlighting a focus on protecting citizens and democracy at large. In the US, we're starting to see pro-regulation figures taking up powerful positions in the Biden administration. So action around the world in reshaping the internet is moving ahead, and it takes many, many forms. Those are the sort of liberal democratic options, but at its most crude, it's just pulling the plug, or perhaps a different, more sophisticated authoritarian approach to internet regulations we might perhaps see in places like China or in Russia. Now, what kind of approach to regulation are we going to see in the UK? Are we protecting individuals or democracy or both? How are we approaching the difficult questions around content that might be harmful, offensive, factually inaccurate, but crucially legal? And perhaps most importantly, where should we be looking for examples of success? How do we encourage good, positive design of online spaces, as well as punish that which we deem not fit for purpose? How do we emulate success? Now, I'm joined by an all-star panel who very patiently put up with my nonsense on the microphone, so thank you. Darren Jones, MP, Chair of the House of the Commons Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy Committee, and Chair of Labour Digital; Catherine Steyer, CEO of Creative Commons; and Lucy Crompton-Reed, Chief Executive of Wikimedia UK. And I suppose, thank you so much for joining me. And I would like to sort of start with the big question that we sort of ask everyone who's been speaking today, which is sort of, when you think about your work or even your personal life and thinking about the future of the internet and your experience of the online world, how would you start answering a question like, what does good look like? Darren, maybe we could turn to you first.
Well, Alex, thanks for that. I'm afraid I have no techno version of my speech, so I apologise for being slightly boring in comparison. I'm optimistic, but also not at the same time in answering this question. In that, and maybe we'll come on to this later, but I think the scope for international collaboration in a way which sets global ethical frameworks or standards is increasingly out of reach. And at the moment, there is no international body with the appropriate mandate or authority to really set that up. So we should endeavour to do that, and I'm supportive of that and do work through my Institute of AI and other bodies at the OECD and the World Economic Forum to try to pursue that agenda. But my view is increasingly difficult. So therefore, the question is, well, what does it mean for citizens? And obviously I'm a member of parliament, so my primary interest is my constituents and people in the UK. And I agree with the government, which is not often what opposition members of parliament say, but that we create the safest place to use the internet for consumers and for businesses in the UK. And there are three interesting angles to that. On consumers, the question is, how much do you give for consumers to lead their own set of terms and conditions, or toggle on and toggle off, or whatever they want to do, versus a regulator-based approach where consumers don't have to take so much of the ownership of their own safety online. I tend to fall on the institutional side, but maybe that's because I'm a politician. There's the issue for businesses. We've got a whole host of work to do, especially around financial online harms, and we're hoping that we might get some of that in the online safety bill later this year. And the risk of cyber and other forms of online threats to business is increasingly difficult without, I don't think, sufficient protections in place, and that requires more action from the state. And the third thing, and this is an increasingly interesting debate, is the defence angle. Safety online isn't just a consumer or civil issue, it's now a defence issue. And we started to see the debate on that really open up with the publication of the integrated review this week, with lots of headlines, but not so much detail. And so as Parliament and as stakeholders and people involved in this debate, we're really going to need to understand what it means to now have a offensive cyber strategy as opposed to just a defensive cyber strategy. I don't want to frighten anyone because I think I probably read it wrong, but I've asked ministers to clarify. In the integrated review, I'm sure it says that we reserve the right now to threaten to use nuclear weapons in response to cyber attacks, including countries part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, if I've read that right, and that wasn't just a mistake, that's a kind of terrifying direction of travel that we ought to try to understand and probably put back in the box. But it just illustrates the debate here about the escalation of the defense side of this conversation, as well as the consumer and corporate side. Sorry to frighten everybody with that as my opener, but
yeah, I think those three sort of priority areas, I think, are very clearly quite. These open up to a very different set of debates. What good looks like to individuals, to business, and definitely from a sort of global diplomatic, maybe even security perspective. I think those are three very different but very interrelated questions, and different states around the world. Thinking about the balance of powers that they are expecting, whether they were willing to trust corporations, whether they're willing to allow individuals to take a risk online, or to look to government or regulation underneath government to act as a kind of protective layer there. I think we are seeing a load of different differences here, different approaches here, and it'd be interesting to see which one we see sort of come out of this, successfully. Lucy, can I turn to you next? When you sort of think about what good looks like, I mean, obviously, I always come back to Wikipedia as one of the sort of 8 wonders of the world here, but perhaps that's not the case. Is Wikipedia all good looks like, or do we need to be even more ambitious?
I mean, I think it's certainly part of what good looks like, definitely. I am feeling slightly terrified, actually, by Darren's point, but I won't dwell on that. I'm going to talk a bit more generally and then come on to the world of Wikimedia. You mentioned in your introduction, Alex, it felt like you were slightly positioning the individual, protecting the individual versus protecting democracy. And I think it's really fundamental that you don't protect individuals unless you're protecting democracy, and a democracy is not worth the paper it's often not written on if you're not also protecting individuals. So I think those things absolutely have to happen in tandem, and that's what makes this so challenging, of course, because it's a question of balance. So in terms of what good looks like to me, it's about an internet where the very best examples of self-governing communities are able to thrive, where the power and the benefit of the commons is really recognized and embraced, at the same time where there is regulation where necessary to guard against harmful content being made available, particularly to young people, but more broadly than that. So I'm afraid it really is a mixture of regulation and also self-governance and self-regulation, in my view. And coming back to what Darren said, I feel like you're much more in this space to know than I am, but I completely agree that international cooperation is what we should be aiming for. And I think individual countries trying to do this in a piecemeal fashion, when, as we know, the internet doesn't have borders in the same way, is never going to give us what we really need in terms of that framework that will enable us to get the best internet that we can. So not disagreeing with anything you said, Darren, I just found it a little bit I guess, disappointing that might be a bit harder to achieve than perhaps it might have felt previously. But yeah, coming back to Wikimedia, obviously I work for Wikimedia. I think it's an extraordinary example of that, the power of the commons. It's not without its flaws. It is very largely self-regulating, a self-governing community. However, at the moment, there is a new universal code of conduct being introduced that's been designed and developed by and with the community, but is nonetheless felt to be something that will enable more people to contribute to Wikimedia, and people that potentially are discouraged at this point. So it is not a panacea, right? There's plenty to do in terms of Wikimedia and elsewhere, but it's a pretty good example, I think.
Catherine, turning to you, Creative Commons, I suppose, has at its core, it has a vision of the web built into it, right? It places openness and freedom of information as, first, I suppose. And do you see your vision as being sort of complementary with the kinds of regulation that's being discussed in the UK?
I think that certainly it's complementary, but looking at what Lucy's just been describing about Wikimedia, I mean, we wouldn't be able to share, reuse, and do what we do with Wikimedia if it wasn't for Creative Commons licenses. And then hearing what Darren's saying about the challenges of trying to get anything agreed internationally being so challenging, so difficult in the current climate. And yet here you have Wikimedia, here you have Creative Commons. Creative Commons was created like Wikimedia 20 years ago. And there's a reason why Wikimedia and Creative Commons this year are celebrating its 20th anniversary, because 20 years ago, we were looking at failed sharing online. What could we do to solve that pressing problem? And Creative Commons was created to solve that pressing problem so that artists, authors, creators could share legally, and it was empowering them to be able to do that with their licenses. Now, 20 years on, we've had a reflective moment with our new strategy to think about, we've achieved so much in 20 years. What are we going to do in the next 20 years? So we address the problem of failed sharing to create open sharing. And now we're looking at how can we have better open sharing, that responsibility aspect, which there's many things 20 years ago we didn't anticipate clearly. And now we're trying to address as we look forward to the next 20 years. But I think at the end of the day, you know, you're going to have, you know, there might be new things like, you know, that come out of some of this, because we can't have international regulation. And therefore, what we're doing in the UK, what's happening in the EU, but look at the EU. GDPR was created, and now that's often taken as a standard across the world. And you had earlier speakers talking about what's happening in Brazil, what's happening in Estonia, what's happening in Taiwan. You know, there's great examples across our world that we can look at. And I am really, you know, good internet for me is about good sharing, but it's also about freeing knowledge and culture to expand our public domain for all of us to benefit across the world. And when you look at bad sharing, you look at kind of proprietary systems that are walled gardens that we can't access. And that's something where I think, you know, we've got real challenges.
So well, that is really inspiring. And it does feel like through systems like Creative Commons and with Wikimedia and these sort of more kind of crowd-based approaches, that we do potentially have some route. We talked about Taiwan and potentially Polis, the software that underpins some of those kind of democratic deliberations. And actually, Demos is running a Polis pilot at the moment with the Cabinet Office, trying to bring that in. Wish us luck. And so, Darren, maybe coming back to you, like, if this is challenging, then how do we sort of take the next steps forward? You know, can we sort of start plotting a path here to think about perhaps it is a coalition of the willing? You know, what does it look like? What does progress here look like when we're looking at internationally specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry I opened up on a point of failure and then mentioned nuclear weapons. I mean, it's probably not the most positive approach to this conversation. It wasn't my intention. It's just things that are on my mind. I mean, look, I think there are different tiers to this, isn't there? There's the tier, I'm thinking about it from the political and government perspective, but there is a tier which is about all of us as citizens. And that is something that is often much more powerful actually in the long run, I think. And these are examples that we've already talked about where we can come together, whether in our own country or across different countries around the world, and bring people together and take a common approach to some of these issues. And you know, I've seen that quite a lot with legislators in other countries as well. So I run a network called the Institute of AI, which brings together legislators around the world interested in AI regulation, and that's the main area in which I talk to my counterparts in many countries now around the world. And we've had great conversations with colleagues in Hong Kong and Taiwan that really brought this kind of you know, political conversation to light. But Taiwan in many ways has got so many great examples of citizen-led democratic approaches and using technology, even in the face of some very challenging governmental and political circumstances. My point on the politics is, where do you go internationally to try to have this negotiation? The UN, let's take that as an example. It's starting to think about the digital space. It's putting together a proposal that Secretary General is supposed to be proposing to member states later this year, but it's going to take a while, and they've had a bit of a bumpy start with their new tech envoy and all that. Maybe we shouldn't talk about that, but you know, there's going to be a slow process. There's the International Telecommunications Union that has done stuff in terms of telecoms and radio, a little bit in space. Maybe that's the place. They have no mandate to deal with AI or some of the more frontier technologies, especially when it comes to ethics. And then if you're going to talk about ethics, well, the ethics in China and other parts of Asia and Russia are clearly very different to ours. And are we really going to get to a consensus on that in the way that we got a consensus between democracies and communism? Well, no. So I think we need to be realistic about that, but find the opportunities where we can collaborate. I ultimately think you're never going to be able to persuade the likes of China or other countries to take a substantively different approach than they currently are taking. And so you're just going to end up with two different types of systems. And in the same way as the broader political system, it's our job to make the best of a liberal, democratic, open, transparent, free system, and to make that case internationally as best as we can.
I think that's really compelling. I think it's a sort of compelling statement in defence of a kind of coalition of the willing among liberal democracies. Lucy, what is the role for organizations like Wikimedia, like civil society more generally in this kind of thing? Because clearly the politics is very, very challenging here, especially when you look at the divergence of approaches, around the world. We often think of our friends and allies in Europe or in America as we all sing from the same hymn sheet, not quite, but actually our approach to the internet is enormously different. What is the role of civil society in perhaps bridging those gaps?
I mean, that's a really interesting question, particularly directed to me. Wikimedia UK has an aspiration to work with civil society to combat specific things, particularly within our current strategy, we're looking at misinformation. I wouldn't describe Wikimedia UK itself as part of civil society, but maybe it is. And one of the things that's been quite interesting over the last 5 years has been the Wikimedia Foundation, which is essentially the parent organisation of my own charity, and which has the legal ownership and control of Wikipedia, based in San Francisco, and a much larger organisation, but obviously we work closely with them. But they made a number of statements over the past 5 years. It's an American-based organisation that had a political feel, shall we say, and I was very much in support of those messages and the statements against things like the Muslim travel ban, and things like that. I think a lot of people felt were an affront to liberal democratic systems. But interestingly, there were people within the editing community of Wikipedia that felt that the Wikimedia Foundation should not be positioning itself in that way, because their own view, I don't want to speak for them, particularly because they probably have a different view to me, but the idea is that information is neutral. My own view is that information is not neutral, unfortunately, and one of the things that we're trying to develop through our programs is a better understanding of the fact that information is never neutral. People always bring their bias to it. We can get to a point of neutrality in a Wikipedia article if lots and lots of people are editing it, and there's some really interesting research that Harvard's done that shows that the more people that edit an article, the more neutral it becomes. But ultimately, every article on Wikipedia is going to have a bias that the people who've written it bring, and so we need to be developing the skills, the information literacy skills to navigate that and to understand it. But I think in terms of what's the role of civil society, well, clearly, I've worked in the non-profit sector my entire career. I think the third sector has an incredibly important role to play, alongside working with government and parliament, to make our world a better place. And it's interesting because I think Wikimedia bridges in some ways it's a social. We're driven by a social mission. Certainly at Wikimedia UK, we're also a technological project, obviously. So I'm not sure I can exactly say what our role is, but it's somewhere in the mix.
Well, it does feel like it does feel like it, and there is a sort of something uncomfortable about the challenges that we have international, thinking about bringing different countries together in thinking about the internet, when the internet companies themselves don't have any problems at all in bringing countries together around.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would be quite so confident in saying that the internet companies themselves have no problem at all. There are. I'm often, sadly, at the moment, not meeting people in person, but I collaborate a lot with international colleagues, and whilst that is an absolutely brilliant experience, of course there are differences. There are cultural differences. There are in some cases technical differences. So some people aren't at the virtual table because of digital exclusion. It's hard, but that doesn't mean it isn't important. But there is a way of doing it. I don't want to suggest that there isn't. Obviously, there'll be Google has staff all over the world. Wikimedia has volunteers all over the world, and we do communicate and share and learn from each other. But that's not without its challenges. But the benefits that brings, that internationalism, that global perspective, I think completely outweighs the challenges. But I think when you're bringing governments into it, different governments into it, it's a wholly more complex matter, as Darren points out.
Catherine, when you're looking at the sort of state of regulation, as it stands, I suppose conversations around regulation in the UK and the US and the EU, and perhaps even more broadly than that, are you sort of struck how the direction of travel is that something that's of concern to Creative Commons, or actually do you see the future being bright here?
What struck me is that there's similar debates happening at Congress and Senate, as happening in the EU, as happening in the UK, and it's all about the same issues. And so, that's quite striking. And then to Darren's comment about, again, back to how we could bring like-minded people together, and about Lucy's comment about community, strikes me maybe, we've got a lot to learn from the climate movement, COP26. Can we not have an equivalent of COP26 for how we solve some of these really, and Darren just mentioned the comment about nuclear weapons. I think that's quite a serious issue in terms of where we are. And so there's something there. I mean, the community that came out of the creation of Creative Commons, when Creative Commons was started, it was, pressing problem, trying to form a solution to this. And then the community came, and built and worked on this, and now we've got over 48 chapters, and this global movement of people who want to help working and building on the commons. So perhaps there's things that we haven't even thought about just now. We'll create a movement in the next 20 years that will build and create and solve some of these problems that we're all facing. But I do think that if you're managing to do for the pressing problem of climate change, the pressing problem of how the globe looks at tech is also a pressing problem. And I think there's something of potential there. I don't know, Darren, with the communications you're having with your fellow politicians, and kind of how, it might be a kind of equivalent of getting this group of people in a room, well, virtually just now, to try and address some of the things that we're all facing, because it's such a wasted opportunity if we don't work together. But if we are where we're at, then it is learning about best practice, and it is going down to that standards interoperability route, where I think we can find ways in a technical level to be able to solve some of the problems.
Darren, would you like to come back on that?
Yes, I mean, look, Catherine is much more experienced than I am at working with politicians across different countries from her time in the European Parliament. So if Catherine says it's doable, then I absolutely agree with her. I'm probably just being a bit grumpy because it's 3 o'clock on a Friday. But we've got to find the space to do that as well. And Catherine is right. There will always be things that we agree on internationally, and there'll be things that we don't agree on. And you've got to try and work on the things that you do agree on. And interoperability and standards and those types of things are about global trade, which is probably something we agree on. How we use those technologies or regulate those technologies domestically are probably the things we disagree on. But you might be able to make some progress on the second while dealing with the first. That my concern is that we're not very good at collaborating on that yet. So again, to go back to the ITU, it's a voluntary organization. Commercial players can be there as well as politicians. Countries can send who they like. They act by consensus, not by votes. Western countries have been hopeless at sending people to the ITU for years. China's been sending loads of people and setting standards through consensus, and now everyone's like, oh, China's taken over the ITU. We weren't sending people. It's our own bloody fault, quite frankly, that we weren't engaging with this issue in the first place. And we've really got to be better at sending people and being part of those global conversations. But there are other platforms, the GPAI, some of the AI collaborations. But again, that's being done very much in a defense competitive space as opposed to a collaborative space. So I just think we need a better strategy around all of this to identify the points that Catherine have highlighted of opportunities for collaboration, and to put the resource and capacity behind it to make the best of it.
And it's also about bringing civil society into that space, because I think civil society users, you talked about consumers earlier, that space of people being heard across the broad spectrum of interest, it seems to be often the commercial players who have got lobbying ability and money to do that are heard much more clearly than consumers, citizens, and civil society more generally.
Can I just jump in to echo that what Catherine's just said? When I've spoken at a few conferences a number of conferences and policy seminars on copyright, and I often find that I'm a sole voice speaking really for the user amongst a lot of right holders with a lot of sway at government level, and you know, and that is absolutely not just, frankly. So I completely agree with Catherine on this potentially even broader issue around internet regulation, that we do need to have civil society who are representative of you know, the person using the internet, and not the people who are commercially exploiting the internet for whatever purposes.
And the UN is consulting on this right now. They're thinking about this right now. So there is an opportunity here to try to create that space and bring the right people around the table. So we should make sure we put our thoughts in to that process.
I think that's an excellent call to action. Moving away a little bbit from the international and thinking a little bit more sort of domestically. Obviously, we have the online harms bill sort of grinding its way towards the light of day, I suppose. And it, you know, it feels like Ofcom's going to take on this role. And I think, yeah, I was struck, actually, Darren, it was a tweet that you sent was it yesterday or the day before, of the question that you put to the Prime Minister, asking him about sort of, would you just talk a little bit about that, because I think it's a nice sort of talking point.
Yeah, but it might be a red herring, because the Prime Minister doesn't always know the answer to the question and says something anyway. So just to put this into context, so first of all, quick update, you probably know this already, the online safety bill is going to be re-announced in the Queen's speech, which we think is going to be kind of the 11th of May, plus or minus a few days. There'll be a period of pre-legislative scrutiny, so there'll be a committee of both houses put together to take evidence, which I assume will run until the summer recess. And then I'm kind of guessing second reading of the bill will come to the House in the autumn, and it will be slow because it's going to be a very complex bill. The committee stage will take forever, and that's before it gets to the House of Lords. So, you know, you're looking 2023, I think, probably before by the time we get to the end of it, which maybe compared to GDPR is pretty fast, but I mean, that's pretty slow from my perspective here in the UK. Now, the big issue has been about the scope of the bill, and there's going to be lots of debates about that, both in terms of harms and regulators and everything else. But the key thing was about the scope of the duty of care, and the DCMS department was quite clear in its response to the white paper that it was about foreseeable physical or psychological harm to the individual, not to us collectively. And so it kind of carved out all of these threats to democracy or consumer collective rights, which, I mean, really ought to be in there, to be honest. But in the integrated review, the government was quite clear that threats to our democracy on the basis of technology and disinformation was a real threat and a real priority. So I asked the Prime Minister, well, if that's the case, are we going to see stuff in the online safety bill that will deal with collective threats, including to our democracy? And he just stood up and said, yes, you will, and sat down again. And I thought, that's not what I was expecting. So either it's going to be in there, in which case we've now got to deal with it, or he hasn't quite read the right memo, and DCMS are going to have to come out and kind of clarify the statement. We don't really know yet kind of which one is which.
And Lucy, perhaps 20 first, like when we think about the harms to democracy, the harms to society, the kind of the big social harms, when, I don't know, I think one of the reasons that it never made it into the or at least initially into the regulation that we saw was obviously this is really bloody difficult. You know, thinking questions around around these kind of the scope of the harms, and then thinking about harms with really difficult definitional questions, and this sort of move towards regulation by principle. Do you think are we saving the regulation by attempting to sort of steer away from these kinds of questions, or actually is it a failing, and that these are sort of fundamental parts that we should, fundamental parts of the forthcoming duty of care that we need to see enacted?
I'm not sure if I have a definitive answer to that question, but what I would say is that the interesting bits are in the grey areas, right? I mean, as always in life, but as say, this bill. And Wikipedia, I mean, as far as I know, certainly from the first iteration, Wikipedia was always within the scope of this. So we've taken an interest in its development, obviously. But I think what's possibly more important, maybe not more important, but equally important, is that we as a movement are also listening to what civil society and others are telling us. So a few years ago, the Samaritans got in contact with me, and it's been a slow moving thing, but I have done a little bit of work with the Samaritans and with the Wikimedia Foundation and with volunteer editors to change some of the coverage of suicide content on Wikipedia. So in some cases it was sort of baby steps. The first Wikipedia to put a suicide hotline number on its Samaritans helpline number on its suicide article or suicide related article was the Welsh Wikipedia. The Welsh Wikipedia is a much smaller community. We have a very active program manager in Wales, who Catherine would probably know, Robin Owain. So he was able to work with the community to make that happen. It's taken a bit longer for other wikis to follow suit, but we have some of the content on those pages. I mean, of course, the content can change all the time. Haven't looked at it this morning, but we engaged a very active editor who's also a medical doctor. So that wasn't stuff that we were, I guess, obliged to do because of regulation. That was stuff that I felt we should do, because if we're being given evidence that that certain bits of content on Wiki are causing harm, are more likely to lead someone to take their own life, then we have to deal with that. I mean, regardless of what it says in the bill, frankly. So my view is that it's, I'm not quite sure I have an answer to your question, I'm really sorry, but I feel like it's about where are the conversations, what's happening in the grey areas, in the cracks, how do we make all of this stuff better? And unfortunately that it's a nuanced approach. It's not ever going to be a blunt tool. It's going to be about conversations and listening and opening up your perspective. And I think that's what I'm interested in helping to facilitate.
Catherine, can I sort of put the same kind of question to you? Really, is thinking about balancing whether it's individual harm versus societal harm, or just generally balancing the interests of individuals versus the wider society. How has that sort of informed, or that coming down somewhere in that debate? How has that been informed in the work that you do?
So, I mean, in the day-to-day work I do in terms of, which is predominantly about licensing and copyright, and thinking about the online harms bill is one where I've taken more of a personal interest in it, because I think that to get the balance right with this, and clearly when you're looking at platform regulation and platform liabilities and the balance with that, because clearly we want to make sure people are safe online, and it's this balancing all the time. When I worked on platform liability as an MEP back working on Article 13 that now became Article 17, it was very much in our wheelhouse to think and reflect on that. And again, within the copyright prism, we've been thinking about platform liability, and our copyright platform at Creative Commons that's going to be working on, they've got kind of 5 areas of work, and one of those areas is on platform liability. But I think that the nuances that have to be considered and the complexity that has to be thought about when if you're seriously going to address this issue and think about the complexity of it, I think that what's laid out in terms of that thoughtfulness, and I was really pleased to see that the Carnegie Trust were so part of influencing what is now in front of us. I think the UK actually, and the thoughtfulness that's gone into this, could really lead the way. And so I'm really encouraged by that, because I think there is certainly a great thoughtfulness that has been put already into this, but the devil will be in the detail when we see what happens with amendments and what goes through Parliament. So I'm a watching brief, but I would say at the moment it's part of some of the work that we're thinking about within some of the work that we're doing within our copyright platform.
I think, yeah, and I think speaking to international participants, and perhaps Darren, you can tell me if I'm off the mark here, is that people were quite excited that we might be sort of introducing this idea of harms to, principles of regulation that were attempting to prevent harm to society. I suppose when you asked that question, were you pleasantly surprised or unpleasantly surprised?
I think I was just bemused. I don't know if I felt anything more than that, to be honest. I mean, it is interesting because the concept of a duty of care, the concept of consumer harm, the concept of regulators working in that space, the concept of regulators being given access to information, is not new. I mean, this is bread and butter stuff, both at European and UK level. It's just that its application to online harms is new. So that's fairly self-contained. And there's going to be, a big debate about how you define harm and what's not legal and illegal but harmful, and who makes that decision. And that shouldn't be people like me, I don't think, in primary legislation making that decision. We should be setting principles and rights that then a regulator with expertise and evidence is able to kind of apply in the real world. But this broader threat, collective threat to our democracy or our way of life, is actually in many ways much more difficult. I mean, we're kind of okay from an infrastructure perspective. When we think about cyber threats or espionage or kind of that type of stuff, how we respond to those is the interesting debate. But visually, we understand that. But the collective threat and the way in which what powers, resource, and capacity you really have to deal with that in a world where disinformation is not new. It's been going on forever. It's just that it's amplified at such speed. And so it's actually more of a technology question than a regulation question. And my concern for a long time has been that we've got to kind of bridge that gap in the Westminster debate between our classic regulatory tools, but also our understanding of technology, and making sure that we have smart regulation that kind of hits both nails on the head.
I think that's really pithy, very pithy, very clear. And I think to sort of come back to our hosts for today. I mean, we had a sort of fireside sort of conversation with Paul, who at GCHQ, who was sort of talking about GCHQ's interest and involvement in fighting not just the sort of the illegal concrete harms that they have to deal with on a daily basis, but with an eye on these much sort of bigger questions around defending democracy and the sort of stability of society. I'm just going to turn to some questions from the audience here. I suppose I'm going to read you a couple of them, and feel free to sort of pick and choose. Johnny asks whether actually the problems, and this kind of comes back to a tweet that I saw yesterday as well. I mean, everything does. That is this actually a problem of tech, or is it a problem of tech amplifying something, some more fundamental imbalances? Are we seeing, and perhaps this is something that we could talk about in the context of the pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic has had a massive change on the way that we on our relationship with technology, probably on a daily basis, which is why you're in a Zoom call at, maybe 4 o'clock on a Friday. Apologies. And how you think that the pandemic might shift our ongoing relationship with technology as we kind of come out the other end. What's going to stay the same? What's going to change? And I think, or another one from Hannah here, which is around online safety legislation and the ability to include civil society in those kinds of conversations. Now, my understanding is that DCMS have been sort of broadly open to consultations and also more informal conversations. But I suppose, how do we bring the role? I think the question to you guys would be, what do you do when you're bringing civil society from very different perspectives together on this? So, whether you, on the one hand, you have civil liberties campaigners, privacy campaigners on one hand, perhaps you have children's charities in the other, who really see this problem in quite different ways with very different priorities. And I think I'd be interested to hear your views on balancing those things. So the role of civil society in this conversation, and also the kind of perhaps what is this technology revealing about our relationship? What did the pandemic reveal about our relationship with technology? Would be my two questions. Catherine, maybe we could start with you.
Well, thank you. So I'll deal with the pandemic first. At Creative Commons, we've always, for a long time, had an open education programme, and you see the importance of open education resources when schools are shut, and also the fact that if you don't have access to open education resources, how challenging it is online to educate children. So I think the open education resource debate is back on the agenda in a way which we hadn't, perhaps predicted before we faced these various lockdowns. So that's maybe one thing. The second thing we did was we instigated with a group of academics at the Open COVID Pledge, which freed up IP, and we were very excited about that, being part of doing something which actually was dealing with a pressing problem of ensuring that people had access to be able to build on, share, reuse this information. And and what we saw, the importance of open access in terms of research during the pandemic as well. But the question about how we're going to, where it goes next as we come out of these lockdowns and we come into a different type of normality. The vaccines is so, you know, we're so excited about the vaccines and that rollout just now. But, you know, I think technology and how we apply it is with us for a longer term, but how we personally, each one of us is interacting. I think there's those of us who work in remote distributed teams anyway, and this is part and parcel of how we work. And Darren, in the House of Commons, you know how democracies work, how parliaments have worked, how they've adapted to some of this stuff or not adapted to some of this is also interesting. But I do think remote working for people, having more choice about how you work, will be certainly part of how we will utilise this technology. Although it's, you know, I'll be so happy when I actually I was recruited to Creative Commons during the pandemic. I've not met my team, I've not met my board, you know, and yet I'm functioning in Dunfermline, running a global community and network, which is empowered by technology. And I think that's just so enabling that we can do that. So there's pros and cons to a lot of things and a lot of unanswered questions that we can't predict yet.
Lucy?
Yes, I mean, I guess my response is going to be really similar to Catherine's, and I think from both a personal and professional perspective. I mean, I've got 2 young children, and the challenges of homeschooling when you're reasonably tech savvy and you have access and you have a spare laptop, you know, were hard enough, frankly. But layering into that, you know, the percentage of people who don't have laptops, who don't have fast broadband, you know, I think it really did, as I think it was Johnny talked about, you know, these issues, some of the divisions in our society and some of the differences in, you know, who has access, absolutely were amplified by our reliance on technology during the pandemic. And in our own shift to an online program, we've noticed that in some ways it was really enabling and has led to much broader geographic inclusion, because we ran a load of in-person events prior to COVID. Ironically, a lot of our program was in person. It's all now online. It's going really, really well. Numbers are up, loads of people from other places, but there are people who actually might have been able to participate in our in-person events who are not able to access our online program in the same way. So we're now that we're no longer in the first pivot online moment, and this is more becoming part of our ongoing normal program, we're looking into that and how we can support that. I know that, I mean, my own experience of my son's literally just walked in the door from his school with his dad, not independently, he's only 8. But the first lockdown, where the school was clearly just absolutely at a loss, and the second lockdown was much, much more structured, but still incredibly challenging if you don't have a whole set of resources, including technical resources. So I really hear that question, and certainly for Wikimedia UK, and the broader global Wikimedia movement, knowledge equity is absolutely core to our strategy, our global strategy to 2030. And knowledge equity means a number of things. It means representing the sum of all knowledge and not just, you know, white male, Northern American, Northern European view, but it also means actually equitable access, and making sure that people can actually access that incredible resource for free. So it's I'm not sure that I can have an answer. I'm sorry, I'm not even sure that I can quite remember what the question is, but I really think that the pandemic has completely thrown open some of those differences in the way that people live and what they can access. And, you know, the whole thing at the beginning about we were all in this together. Well, we were in the same storm, but we were in very different boats.
Right.
So, and then coming back to the other question, that I just think it's going to be incredibly important to make sure that there are those mechanisms for civil society to contribute to development of the bill, to make sure that, you know, it's really robustly looked at as it's going through Parliament, and also to make sure that how it's monitored, how it's implemented, is properly monitored, and that, you know, if iterations are needed, and certainly making sure that Ofcom, as the regulatory body, assuming that that is what happens, you know, have those mechanisms in place so that there is a proper feedback loop. Because this is, I think Darren said, you know, it's nothing new, but at the same time, we've seen stuff being codified in ways that aren't new.
Darren, I suppose you as an MP, you're speaking to your constituents. They will have experienced this this pandemic, and in very different ways as well. And I think for many, it's been really, really difficult. I mean, perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, there's a good news story and a bad news story. The good news story, which again I've seen at constituency level as well as across the country, is the acceleration of digital adoption in a way that we wouldn't have had but for the pandemic. So let me give you some examples. I used to get loads of complaints about how long it would take to get a GP appointment. Unless you were literally like on the phone at 8 a.m. trying to get an urgent slot, you wouldn't be seen until you were better, essentially. And people say, what's the point? And the poor GPs are working God knows how many hours every day trying to get through it, or got all this admin to do. And it was just a real point of frustration. Now, I don't get them. Because most people either do an e-consult online or they have a video conversation, and if it's minor and can be done in that way, it gets sorted pretty quickly, and the prescription service is pretty good if you need one. And then the patients actually need to be seen physically can get there in a timely fashion and be seen, which is great. Again, the hospital, I've got one of Europe's largest hospitals in my constituency. It didn't do digital discharge. It was all paperwork and fax machines, remarkably. They've now got digital discharge. They have iPads, and they kind of discharge you based on the iPad, and it goes to your care provider, it goes to your GP, it goes wherever it needs to go. And the 2 hospital trusts in the city of Bristol now have the same server platform, so they can talk to each other. I mean, remarkable. I mean, I don't know why this didn't happen 20 years ago, but it's happened now, and that's really, really good. The downside is the digital poverty issue. My constituency is very mixed. I've got some of the most kind of affluent suburbs in the city and some of the most economically deprived. And I've really seen that difference. So some of my private schools just carried on like there was no problem. They were all actually already using online classrooms for kind of catch up and additional tuition. Everything just kind of went on. Everyone was broadly pretty happy and just getting on with it. Some of my kind of state schools were in a massive state of distress. They didn't have laptops. If they did get laptops eventually from the government, the kids didn't have the internet to use the laptop, so they had to start putting things on USB pens. They were kind of having kids using one mobile phone in the house, and so some kids were getting education and some weren't. They had their attendance problems, and they were just really stressed about it. And it's exacerbated and highlighted some of the existing poverty and inequalities, but in the digital context. Now, the opportunity from that is that now we're all talking about it and have experienced it and have realized it, and actually people who aren't in that situation understand it better. There should be more of an impetus to solve these problems. So I introduced a 10-minute rule bill, which isn't really a bill, it's just a soapbox really, to call for a social tariff on broadband, so that families on universal credit get cheap broadband. And the minister didn't say no, which was good. He said, I want the internet companies to try to sort it out first, and if they don't do it, then we'll press the statutory button and get Ofcom to sort it out. The internet company said to me, we're into this, we want to do it. The only problem is we can't validate universal credit status. So I went to go and speak to the universal credit minister and said, I need you to build an API to validate universal credit status. And do you know what he said? Oh, we can do that. And I was like, wow, this is amazing, because you've just had your new servers installed at the Department of Work and Pensions. Very good. So we've now just got to get it built in the development stack. And then suddenly we're kind of getting a solution and people are pointing in the right direction. So it's highlighted lots of challenges, but it's also, I think, highlighted our ability to solve them using technology, which 10 years ago we would have got stuck. So we've just got to keep up the momentum on that. In terms of the question on civil society in the bill, please engage in the pre-legislative scrutiny process. That's exactly why I wanted us to have pre-leg scrutiny. The downside is it pushes back the presentation of the bill, but it does mean there's going to be a space where you'll be able to, a bit like a select committee, submit evidence, be part of a conversation, and really go through it in detail before it makes its way formally to the floor of the House of Commons. So as soon as that's announced after the Queen's speech, make sure you know how to submit and engage with that, because that will be your key opportunity to influence that debate. It doesn't happen on every bill, so take it as a big opportunity.
Let's just sort of add a couple of questions here. One, we've sort of talked about inequality, opportunity of access as one of these sort of key principles that I think we all share, as that we've learned about from the pandemic, and also that underpin a lot of the work that we do. I think another really kind of key concept that has come up, and Colette's question here, is around redress and what we do about both users experiencing abuse, but also users having decisions about their content or their behavior made by platforms and their ability to challenge that. I was wondering whether you, obviously you come at this question, from very, very different positions, whether as a legislator or as somebody running a specific kind of tech platform. I think a lot of the questions we have do tend to focus on platforms like Facebook, like Twitter, which are policed in a very different way to somewhere like let's say Wikipedia. So what about, how might users expect redress under a system of regulation? How do you think that would work best? And I suppose the second question, Darren, perhaps this is that we have a number of questions here for you around various different sort of international constellations of countries that may or may not come together, whether that is the GAFAM or a D10 group of democracies. My understanding from what you were saying was that perhaps we should be looking to the UN. They are consulting here, but if there is a sort of a kind of Avengers, Marvel team of countries or otherwise organization that you think should be highlighted here, it'd be great to hear it. Lucy.
I just wanted to clarify, are you asking, so in the absence of the bill having been passed, what are the, I think that's the question, isn't it? What avenues are there? And I think it comes, if that's the correct interpretation of the question, I think for me, and I'm really speaking about Wikimedia here, I think, to be honest, if we get to the point with Wikimedia where the bill is where the law is the thing that's causing content to be removed or issues of abuse to be addressed, then we've actually failed in terms of the self-governing nature of the project. I fear those words because perhaps in 2024 there'll be some dreadful instance, and someone will remind me, you said that will be a failure if the bill is used. But genuinely, there is a massive community on Wikimedia. I think 280,000 people edit it a month, and so whilst it's not a social media platform in the same way as something like Facebook and Twitter, it is a platform where there is a lot of interaction between people, and sometimes, of course, that causes issues. And so there is harassment and abuse that occurs on Wikimedia, and I can't pretend otherwise. It's not on the same scale as those platforms, but it exists because any situation where people are communicating online, these things do arise. However, there are already lots of things in place to ensure that those issues are picked up and addressed. So those processes have been developed and iterated and refined by the community. So certainly speaking in terms of Wikipedia and the other Wikimedia projects, Wikidata, Wikimedia Commons, Wikisource and so on, I would have a certain level of confidence that issues like that would already be redressed. In terms of the broader question, I'm not sure that I'm best placed to answer, because it feels like actually there is a gap. I know Facebook is setting up have set up the oversight board, and that will be dealing with particular issues and looking at where content, what's the balance in terms of taking content down and leaving it up. Obviously, all of those platforms have their own mechanisms for dealing with this stuff. But I'm not sure. I think there probably are gaps. And we may, that's ultimately why the legislation is being developed, right?
Right. Yeah. I think, Darren, this question of redress has come up quite a lot, at least in conversations that I've seen around online harms, and how it really is a real sort of screaming gap at the moment in the way that the platforms operate. Is that something that you found in your conversations?
Yes, but it's a broader discussion than just the online harms bill. So there are kind of three ways for consumer redress. There's voluntary consumer redress ran by the platforms. So there's a complaint or a flag button or something, and they kind of take content down or ban an account or whatever. That works to a certain degree, but doesn't solve all of our problems. You've then got this other bucket of thought, which is around the consumer directed kind of response to redress, which is dealing with your privacy settings or who can access your content or removing yourself from a platform. I never believe that you should just put all of the onus on consumers here, because I think they need to be protected. You've then got this third element, which is where we broadly end up with the online safety bill, which is about a regulator-based approach for redress. Now, that's fine, but in practice, in the UK at least, we don't really have an effective regulatory response to consumer redress anyway. In some of the most regulated areas like telecoms, maybe energy. You've got some good regulators, you've got some good ombudsmen who can kind of process these things for you and get you to an answer. There's a huge chunk of the economy, though, where there are no regulators or ombudsmen, and you either rely on the Competition and Markets Authority, which is the ultimate institution for consumer redress, or there's like nowhere else to go. And so you don't get redress, because if the airline isn't giving you your money back but only giving you a voucher, or the company's sent you a broken thing and there's nowhere to take it apart from the small claims court, but then you're not going to do that unless you're particularly motivated and you know how to do it and you've got the money. It doesn't work. Now that whole piece is being reviewed anyway, because in this kind of post-Brexit competition world where we're looking at state aid, and John Penrose, a Tory MP, has just done a review for the government which has looked at some of these issues. There's a debate about how we broaden the institutional coverage to give more access to consumer redress, and I think that's a huge piece of important work that we need to get right. It won't be in the online safety bill, but it will have implications for online safety through Ofcom and or its successor regulator under the online safety bill. So we kind of need to look a bit broader to get that right. Did you want me to answer the D10 question or just stop?
Please, yeah.
Okay, feel free to tell me to shut up. But so the D10 question, so these are the 10 democracies. This is Boris Johnson's kind of hope for a new global network. It's built on the G7, but it includes New Zealand, India and South Korea. I think those are the additional three. It's part of the Prime Minister's Indo-Pacific tilt analysis, and it's trying to ensure that the UK is still kind of leading a collaborative discussion amongst democracies in the face of what he would describe as authoritarian regimes in the region, and that we would collaborate on technology standards, supply chains, ethics, those types of issues. It could work. The Biden administration, though, has a slightly different view. And I think it will be interesting to see where we get to, especially with the UK's presidency of the G7 this year, as to whether we go via a Biden-led quad in the region plus G7, or whether we end up really pursuing the D10 thing. I don't think the Prime Minister's really won that debate yet internationally, so we're going to have to watch that space.
Really helpful. Catherine, just turning to you on these questions, but I'll just throw another one in there as we kind of come to a close here, where I'm looking through the chat and we hear this question almost inevitably when it comes to thinking about tech and government and regulation, is around pace, pace, speed of change, and whether or not we are capable of keeping up with the pace of technological change. Now, my guess is that the argument that I've heard, maybe made by Carnegie and Will and Lorna there, or perhaps also by DCMS, is that a principles-based approach gives you a lot more sort of flexibility, a lot more ability to future-proof there. Yeah. What's your view?
I agree that is an approach which is helpful, and yes, the pace of change that we're facing is phenomenal. Look how things have changed in the past 20 years, and actually look in the 90s how hopeful we were about tech and the transformation, and moving to today. Who would have thought that we would have this misinformation and I mean it's we've got a lot of learning to do, but I think the only thing that's constant in life is change, and I think that when it comes to technology, never is that so true. I think that I was actually reflecting a little bit before I came on this, and I was thinking about, well, how do we bridge this gap? And Darren, you've talked about bridging the gap between parliamentarians and technologists, and I'm thinking about the audience here today, and I'd encourage each and every one of them to think about going into politics to actually make some change, because there is a gap, and and the complexities that we have to address take more consideration, more reflection, more information that we have to gather, but also we have to make decisions about some of these key things. And I think that many people in this audience are very well placed to be able to think and be thoughtful about that. On the consumer question and the previous question, I remember working on the online dispute resolution work in the European Parliament. I think we've got a lot to learn from that work that went on and how to help about consumer redress as well. But the pace of change question is one that we're going to be living with continually, and it's one that we are really going to have to get to grips with, how we all work together to solve the pressing problems that we face.
That's brilliant. Guys, thank you so much. I'm going to bring this panel to a close, and I suppose with the close of this panel, the whole day of events as well. So Lucy, Catherine, Darren, thank you. You're brilliant. Thank you so much for giving up your time on yet another Zoom call, but that is what the good web is. My one request is to all of the participants. I think we had 300 sign-ups, maybe up to 100 people at any one time. Thank you so much for coming along. Do stay in touch. Find us on Twitter. Drop us an email. And myself and my colleagues will be in the networking session of this festival for a little bit now. So if you do want to come and have a chat, please do. Thanks again, of course, to GCHQ for the support in making today happen. And I hope to see you all at the next Good Web Festival, unless, of course, it's Darren's nuclear apocalypse or whatever. Thank you, everybody.